Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A critical meeting of foreign ministers from the G20 has ended in New Delhi, India, without any agreement on the Ukraine war. The meeting wrapped up after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke briefly in the first reported high-level meeting between U.S. and Russian officials in months. Their 10-minute conversation came after a Russian missile slammed into a high-rise apartment building in the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia, killing at least 4 people. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials said for the first time they're contemplating a tactical withdrawal from the eastern city of Bakhmut, where Russian forces have mostly cut off remaining civilians from humanitarian aid. This is Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky speaking earlier this week.
The hardest thing is still Bakhmut and the battles that are essential for the city's defense. I'll give you just one example. We are holding the staff meeting quite often now, at least twice a week. The last meeting was on Thursday, and today, General Syrskyi reported that since this last meeting, about 800 enemies have been killed in his direction alone. Russia does not count people at all, sending them to constant assaults on our positions. The intensity of the fighting is only increasing.
Finland's parliament has voted overwhelmingly to join NATO, setting the country up to become the military alliance's 31st member. Wednesday's vote came just days after Finland began constructing a 120-mile wall topped with razor wire along its 800-mile border with Russia. In Hungary, the party of far-right Prime Minister Viktor Orban said Wednesday it'll endorse the expansion of NATO to include Finland and Sweden. That leaves Turkey as the only NATO holdout. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has rejected Sweden's accession to NATO after accusing it of harboring dissidents he considers terrorists. Sweden and Finland had hoped to join NATO simultaneously. At least that's what the United States government wanted. The Biden administration has announced $619 million in high-tech arms sales to Taiwan, including new missiles for its F-16 fighter jets. The deal will primarily benefit weapons makers Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. After the sale was announced, Taiwan reported China's Air Force flew warplanes into airspace Taiwan considers part of its air defense identification zone for the second consecutive day. The U.S. Air Force says it's relieved 6 officers at a North Dakota nuclear missile base after their units failed a nuclear safety inspection. It's not clear exactly what lapses prompted the firings. The Minot Air Force Base is home to more than 24 B-52 nuclear-capable bombers, as well as 165 Minuteman III nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles. This follows a previous safety lapse at the base in 2007 when a B-52 bomber flew to Louisiana carrying 6 nuclear-armed cruise missiles without the knowledge of the flight's crew. In Israel, police fired tear gas and stun grenades Wednesday at thousands of people who'd blocked a highway in Tel Aviv to protest plans by the far-right government of Benjamin Netanyahu to gut Israel's judiciary. 11 Israelis were hospitalized with injuries. It was the first time during weeks of mass protests that police used large-scale violence against Israeli citizens. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, dozens of protesters dressed as handmaids from Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel The Handmaid's Tale rallied outside Israel's Supreme Court Wednesday.
Basically, it feels like we can say goodbye to democracy because on one hand, the Knesset will have the ability to pass any law they want. On the other hand, the court will not have the ability to stop anything like that. Any court that would hurt whether women or LGBTs or any other minority is going to pass with no one to stop it.
The protests came as the U.S. State Department condemned the comments of Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who on Wednesday called on Israel to erase the Palestinian town of Hawara. His comments came after Jewish settlers attacked the town Sunday, burning cars and homes and killing a Palestinian man. This is State Department spokesperson Ned Price.
Were irresponsible. They were repugnant. They were disgusting. And just as we condemn Palestinian incitement to violence, we condemn these provocative remarks that also amount to incitement to violence. We call on Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials to publicly and clearly reject and disavow these comments.
Later in the broadcast, we'll go to Hawara on the occupied West Bank, as well as Tel Aviv. The U.S. intelligence community has rejected claims that a foreign power was responsible for a series of unexplained injuries and illnesses suffered by U.S. officials working overseas. The episodes were dubbed Havana syndrome after diplomats at the U.S. and Canadian embassies in Cuba reported dizziness, headaches, and other symptoms in 2016. Since then, about 1,500 U.S. officials have reported ailments in 90 countries. After a 2-year investigation and assessment by 7 U.S. intelligence agencies found no credible evidence that any U.S. adversary possessed a weapon that could explain the ailments, which the report said were likely due to pre-existing conditions, conventional illnesses, and environmental factors. At the White House, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said the report's findings did not mean the U.S. would end medical support for those suffering.
This doesn't change the commitment that the president has in making sure that these families, our colleagues in the workforce, get the help and assistance that they need, and they're going to continue to work through that.
In Greece, at least 46 people were killed and dozens more hospitalized after a passenger train collided with a freight train late Tuesday in the central city of Larissa. It was the worst rail disaster in Greek history. On Wednesday, the Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, accepted the resignation of top transportation officials and said the crash was primarily due to, quote, tragic human error. Greece has declared 3 days of national mourning. Meanwhile, in Athens, police in riot gear fired tear gas at protesters who gathered outside the offices of the private company responsible for maintaining Greece's railways. Greece privatized its rail system and other public infrastructure in 2017 as part of an IMF bailout amidst the debt crisis. New York City has agreed to pay a multi-million-dollar settlement to protesters who were aggressively boxed in or kettled by New York police during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that swept the country following the police murder of George Floyd in 2020. Over 300 people who were kettled, then beaten, detained, or arrested by New York police at the June 4th, 2020 Bronx protest will each receive $21,500. It's believed to be the largest class action settlement in a case of mass arrest. About a third of the demonstrators also previously settled with the city in separate claims. A Human Rights Watch investigation said the NYPD's conduct that day amounted to, quote, serious violations of international human rights law. In California, around 80 prisoners at 2 immigration and customs enforcement facilities have gone on hunger strike for nearly 2 weeks. They say they are willing to risk their lives to fight against the inhumane conditions they're facing. A group of the hunger strikers from the Mesa Verde and Golden State Annex jails sued ICE and the private prison corporation GEO last week for retaliating against them by cutting off their heat, denying family visits and recreational time, and threatening solitary confinement. This is a striker speaking anonymously over the phone from the Golden State Annex. Listen closely.
I don't see it as a containment facility. It's a prison. It's 4 walls. People are packed in here like sardines. So they could call it in other words for this place. It's a prison for me.
The hunger strike follows a labor strike protesting prisoners' $1 per day wage for 8-hour shifts. Earlier this week, local activists held a solitary protest at the Oakland State Building. Also this week, demonstrations took place across the United States, marking 20 years of harm by ICE, the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection. Organizers are calling for an end to government funding of the agencies, which over the past 20 years have systematically targeted immigrants, Muslims, and communities of color using surveillance, detention, torture, military occupation, and inhumane immigration policies, they say. This is Dr. Mahalal from the Muslim Counterpublics Lab, speaking at Wednesday's protest in D.C.
The DHS has surveilled, detained, tortured, and punished communities with draconian immigration laws. DHS has also targeted Black Lives Matter activists, created and spearheaded a countering violent extremism program to target Muslim communities, tearing families apart, putting people in cages, and executing foreign nationals across the border.
A judge has ordered Starbucks to reinstate illegally fired employees, reopen closed stores, halt union-busting tactics, and take other reparative measures after ruling Starbucks engaged in egregious and widespread misconduct following the establishment of the chain's first unionized store in Buffalo, New York. Meanwhile, dozens of white-collar Starbucks workers have signed an open letter condemning Starbucks union busting and protesting the company's return-to-office mandate. The workers say, quote, morale is at an all-time low and warn, quote, these actions are fracturing trust in Starbucks leadership. In Illinois, residents and activists from Chicago's South Side successfully passed two measures in this week's city election, calling for housing protections related to the construction of the new Obama Presidential Center. The 19-acre center will house a public library, playground, community centers, and a museum. But community members in the majority Black South Shore say the project has already led to gentrification and displacement. The measure passed Tuesday calls for eviction protections and rental assistance, city funding for home repairs and mortgage assistance, development of affordable housing on city-owned lots, and 75% affordable housing on a vacant city-owned lot in nearby Woodlawn. Groups organizing with the Obama Community Benefits Agreement Coalition celebrated the overwhelming approval of the non-binding referenda and say they'll continue fighting to make sure Chicago follows through on their demands. And Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg has announced he's been diagnosed with inoperable pancreatic cancer, giving him an estimated 3 to 6 months to live. It was 51 years ago that the New York Times began publishing excerpts of the Pentagon Papers leaked by Dan Ellsberg, 7,000 pages of top-secret documents outlining the Pentagon's secret history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam since the 1940s. The leak exposed years of government lies and would end up helping to end the war in Vietnam and lead to a major victory for press freedom. Dan Ellsberg reports that since his cancer diagnosis, he's done several interviews and webinars on topics including Ukraine, nuclear weapons, and First Amendment issues. Ellsberg wrote, quote, I work better under a deadline. It turns out I live better under a deadline. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report.